Okay, I'm going to show you how to understand a little bit more about the basics of Photoshop. If you are already a Photoshop user, you can likely disregard this video. And I will not claim to be a master in Photoshop, but I know how to get accomplished what I need to get accomplished. If you're brand new to Photoshop, this is a kind of a difficult program to kind of wrap your head around because it doesn't do things that you would expect it to. When I opened up Photoshop, these were the other photos that I've been working with. So we're going to start fresh, and we're just going to say open, and I'm going to pick a picture to work with. Okay, and so I opened up this picture, just a random shot of my dog sitting there looking out the window. So it's kind of a good picture. But anyway, I basically just want to show you how does Photoshop work. Okay, so when I just said open this picture, and by default, this just happens to be the shape of the screen of the aspect ratio of this particular frame. So if you're working in a film environment, typically this isn't very helpful because if you just let it default in whatever it's going to default at, this aspect ratio isn't going to reflect a television screen. So what you typically would want to do is you're going to say new, and underneath here there's some default different things to select from. And so up here you'll see where there's these different things to select film and video, and then you can pick different aspect ratios to work with. And so I'm going to just pick this 1920 by 1080, but there are 4K ones as well that you can create, and you can always change these things later by just changing the width and the aspect ratio this way. So 1920 by 1080 is a typical HD video file. I also want to point out resolution. Okay. Most televisions and screens that we look at do not have a resolution higher than 72. So by changing this to anything greater is actually just making a larger file that no one will actually see this information. So I would say if you're working in the television medium, leave this as 72. If you're working in the print medium, then you might change that to 300 because when you want to print something, you want a little higher resolution. But as far as this, I would say 72 pixels per inch is what you want to work with, okay? All right, and I'm going to just select this and say create. And by default, this is what the screen is going to look like. Notice I'm going to tell you what these things are as well, but by default I've got this white background and I've got these little guides here. And these guides are basically telling me what is picture safe and what is title safe. Okay, so if you are putting a title, typically you want to be inside this interior box here. Okay, what happens is when you export something and then you put it on TV, you tend to lose 10% of what is your frame. Not always, but often. So you want to be aware of titles going within this area here. Don't get them right up against the edge there because they might get cut off. I also want you to start thinking about that, understand that Photoshop is a layers program. And so here you'll see the first layer, and it just says background by default. Okay, and then you've got this little lock screen here. So that is just letting you know that you can't change this unless I turn it off. And so now I can do whatever I want to this. In order to delete a layer, first let me do this. I'm going to import that same image that we were just working with, and I'm going to do it in a different kind of way here. So up at the top here, you can see I've got the new one I just created, and here's the dog. So these tabs here, you can have multiple things happening at one time, and you can tear it away. And so now I'm looking at the dog picture, and I also can see the other one. I'm just going to take this layer and just drop it in here. So now I put the dog in this other one, and I don't even really need this one open anymore, so I'm going to go ahead and close it. So the dog picture is much bigger than the HD image that we're working with, which we created when we created the new file. So there's different ways of changing the size of it, but notice what I have to do is I have to select the layer, then you go to Edit, Transform, or let's say Free Transform, or Command T. All right, and then I still can't see the edges of it. So what I typically do is I go down here. I'm going to change this to a small number, let's say 25, so I can see these boxes here. So now what I'm doing here, when I change this, I'm just changing the amount of stuff that I can see. That this is still 1920 by 1080. I've just shrunk the whole screen so that I could see this. And notice that if I hover over these different pieces here, one of them is this little curved one means that I can change the rotation of it. I'm going to undo that with Command Z. If I click on it, then I can change the size of it. So now I can change the size of this thing so that it's going to fit within here. Now the aspect ratio doesn't fit inside this, so I'm going to have to figure out what to do. But for now, I'm just going to go with this, all right? And nothing has happened yet until I hit enter. Once I hit enter, now those changes that I made are going to be visible. And now if I go back here and just type in, let's say 75, so I can see the whole image that I'm looking at here, okay? And so you also have these eyeballs here, so I could turn off different layers if I want to just not see them. That's what those are doing here. You have these different ways of viewing things, just like in After Effects. So you have these workspaces. And so let's go ahead and this is the essentials. This is the default, and that's fine. But I'm going to just go ahead and put graphics and web for now. And notice what it does is it changes everything over here to different tools that were always available to you. You just didn't see them. Okay, the character, this deals with text information, where you can pick your fonts and the various tools that you want to work with here. All right, so I'm just going to kind of explain what these different things are. So the layer system is kind of the thing that you have to be aware of. And so if you hover over any of these things, notice that they tell you what they are. So if you're ever lost and you want to find something, that's a good way to do it. And the help window is really good as well. So let's say I wanted to create a quick mask or a quick something. How to do that. It immediately shows me how to do it. So it's a very good help system here. All right. So if you wanted to create a new layer, so whatever layer is active, and then I went over to one of these tools here, this little T here is the text tool, and I started typing. I can't see it because it's tiny. So maybe if I select it, and I'm going to make this text huge. So now we can see it a little bit better. I'm going to change the color of it to white so I can see it. All right, so the text lives there now. But notice that the text layer here is a layer unto itself. So I can turn that on and off. Okay, so and then I can make it bigger by, again, if I hit the letter V, that goes back to this select tool. So this is the basic tool that you want to use most of the time. And now if I select that layer, I can then hit Command T like we did earlier. Okay, and then I can change the size of this text. And you can see that it changes over here as well. And then if I if I hold in the Shift button, I can select this dot and then change the aspect ratio of it if I choose to. All right, and then if I want to get rid, and then I hit Enter to have that be acknowledged, that size change. And if I want to get rid of this, I select the layer and I drag it down into the trash here. If I want to create a new layer, I click on that, and at the moment, so then I select this layer, and then anything that I do to that layer, let's say I create a mask or something, that is now existing in here. So I clicked on this little triangle here, and I just clicked and dragged, and that created this shape here. And then the shape can you can do all kinds of different things with it. You could fill it with different colors. Notice that this tool here is selected. Okay. And if I want to get rid of this layer, I'm going to just get rid of it that way. Okay. This is the one where I would typically create like a box. Let's say I wanted to create, I wanted this area to be a new layer. So I can make this selection. When you see these dots, we call that marching ants. When you see the marching ants, that means there's a selection ready to be manipulated. And so if I go underneath select, or I say layer, new, via cut, or let's say copy. Okay, so notice what it did over here, layer 2. If I turn off these other layers here, now what I just selected there is now going to be highlighted. I mean, it will be the entire layer. And I've got this duplicated here, so you can you won't see anything when I change it on, turn this on and off, because it's this same exact thing sitting on top of the other image here. Okay, this is a lasso tool, and the lasso tool is another way of selecting, and so you can kind of like click and drag around your object, and when you close it, now you get the marching ants, and so it's another way of selecting it. All right, and if I want to get rid of this selection, this is important. You hit Command D, and that turns off the selection. That took me a long time to learn that tool, but it's very important to know that one. Now you'll also see that there's these little triangles here. When you hold in the triangle, it means there's different tools underneath there. So the Magic Wand tool, basically you just click in an area, and then that would largely make a selection for you. And I find that the Magic Wand tool doesn't work all that much. I have a separate video just about selections, so I'm not going to get too much into selections. I'm just showing you what they are right now. So to get rid of these marching ants, I'm hit Command D. And I'm also going to get rid of this layer here that I created. All right, and then underneath here we also have the Quick Selection tool, which we will talk about in another video. This is the Crop tool. I don't typically use these slice tools. These are usually for building websites. So this crop tool basically allows me to crop the image. If I just wanted his head, then his head has been cropped. I'm undoing that, Command Z. All right, so there's a difference between when you crop something. I'm going to go hit the letter V, or this here to go back to the Move tool. And then I want you to notice underneath image, you have an image size and you have a canvas size. The canvas size is, let's go to pixels, because we're working in pixels, is 1920 by 1080. So the canvas is the whole thing. Okay, the image size refers to the layer that's selected. And let's go back to pixels, is also 1920 by 1080 at the moment. Okay, so you can change the image of a layer versus the whole canvas. Okay, this tool here is the eyedropper tool. So a lot of times you want to select a color. So I can, let's say, select this color back here. And then notice what it did is it changed the color in this character tool, because that happens to be the one available. But we also have other tools, like this thing over here is foreground, background. Okay, so you can swap these here. So basically, if I want this to create a new layer, let's say I want a new layer, and I want to fill that layer with something. Okay, notice that this layer over here is empty. There's these checker box here. And I want to fill it. So with this layer selected, I'm going to say Edit, Fill. And what do I want to fill it with? Do I want to fill it with black, or white, or 50% gray, or foreground, background, or a color? Foreground is this black, background is that white. That's what it's referring to when you see that. Okay, if I want it to be a color, now here's where you can use this eyedropper for maybe you want to get using a palette within the same sort of world that you're working with. Let's say I want that blue. So I'm selecting that bluish gray, and I say OK. And I'll say OK, and it fills this entire layer with that color. Now you can't see anything beneath it now, because you can kind of see that this layer is on top of it. So if I want to swap those, I just click and drag. Now the dog layer is on top of the other one. And what's important to understand too is that if you need to have them interact with one another, then you might have to change maybe the opacity. And you'll see that you have these tools here like opacity. So I change this opacity down, you can start to see the layers that are beneath this dog layer. Or I could change the size of it by selecting this layer, Command T, and then I'm going to again change the size of this to something smaller so I can kind of see it. But you can see that this dog and that thing is still behind it. Okay, let's go back to 75%. Okay, going down the tools here, color sampler is very similar. There'll be instances where you want to sample a color. The paintbrush tool. Notice also when you click on these things, all the stuff up here changes. So I click on that, and so you have different settings for each one of these tools. So all of them can be, the tools can be manipulated. So if I go to this brush tool and then I want to select, let's say, actually cancel. If I'm in this brush tool and I want to change the type of brush, general brushes, let's say I can just pick this hard round brush. Okay, and then if I start painting, you'll see that those colors are there. And hit undo. Let's go ahead and change the color here. So if I just click on this little object there, now that changed the color of this paint. And you can do all kinds of different things with that. If I hold the shift while I drag it, it will create a straight line. Okay. And then we have this is called the eraser tool. So you can change the size of this tool. And then let's say I want to erase a portion of this frame, and we will be doing some of that as later. So I select that, and then I can erase the dog's head. Okay, that doesn't help us all that much, but just so you understand. All right, then we have this other tool, which is called gradation tool. So let's go back to this other layer, and let's go ahead and notice the gradation right now is from red to white when I selected that tool. If I click on this and let's say I want to go from blue to white or whatever I choose, and then I'm going to click and just drag. Let's hide this dog layer here. It basically created this gradation here. So I can easily change these things. Let's say I want it to be pink, and then the bottom part is going to go to gray, pink, okay. And so that's another way of just creating gradation, depending on how far you drag it. So it's a way of creating backgrounds and filling different things in here as well. All right. Then we have our text tool, and that relates to all this stuff here. This tool is going to be a pen tool. So by default, it looks like that. And so then you can kind of, if I click on multiple places, it's another way of selecting. It can also be a way to do other tools with, but mostly we use the pen tool in Photoshop to select. Okay, this arrow tool is a path selection. I'll talk about later. These tools are, so if I wanted to create a shape and then fill that shape, it could be a different thing here. Let's go ahead and take this shape. It's with rounded edges. The other tool here that I would point out has this little magnifying glass here, and so if you click on that, it just blows it up. So it's another way of doing it. If I hold in the option button on the Mac, it turns it from a plus to minus so that you can change it here. So there's a whole bunch of tools. I've only scratched the surface on what all this is, but these are the basic interface that you need to know about Photoshop.